You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on September the 2nd, 2024.
It's 2 a.m. in Tokyo, 2000 in Jerusalem, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Russia continues trying to bomb Ukraine round to its way of thinking. Israel brought to a standstill by protests. And why is it so hard to persuade some people to take a day off? I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Aliona, Hlivco and Simon Brooke will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Fawaz Gerges about his new book looking at how and why attempts to foster democracy in the Middle East have often had counterproductive consequences. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Aliona Hlivco, founder and CEO at St James's Foreign Policy Group, and by Simon Brooke, the journalist and communications consultant. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Good evening.
Aliona, I don't need to ask you where you've been recently because I know because I was there as well, i.e. at Globsec in Prague, and we will get to that presently. But alert listeners will have noticed that we are now introducing you under another job title. So you have a new job, but please tell us about it.
Indeed, and a super exciting one. I am now one of those female founders, and I'm really proud to become one. I founded my own company, a foreign policy advisory, called, as you rightly mentioned, St. James's Foreign Policy Group, that will focus on advising clients on foreign policy risks, all the emerging new hybrid warfare technologies emerging around the world, strategic communications around that, and potential market entry into very good and very promising markets like Ukraine, my home country, but the ones that definitely need a lot of guidance.
So probably not going to be advising too many people to invest heavily in Russia?
Not at the moment.
Simon, you this will come up fairly shortly as a subject, as will, Simon, something pertaining to your latest endeavours. You are, and I'm impressed when anybody attempts to teach themselves or learn any new language, because I remain shamefully monoglot myself and incredibly annoyed with myself for being such, but I have realised that I have absolutely no aptitude for learning any new languages, and you are throwing yourself at one of the famously tricky ones.
It is, according to the US State Department, which grades languages in terms of how difficult they are. Japanese is one of the top 4, 5, I think, but I'm planning to go there next year. So as part of a completely immersive experience, I am teaching myself Japanese.
How far have you got?
I can't yet say in Japanese that my Japanese isn't going very well, so that gives you some indication. But I'm getting there. I can say a few useful phrases, and I'm hoping to get a Japanese teacher so that I can actually do more than I can on an app and actually ask some questions. So come back to me in about a year's time, and I'll see. I'll let you know how I got on.
And you can answer in Japanese. Or, in fact, given what I have just said about my own complete lack of facility with languages, you could answer by reading the back of a menu and I would have not the least idea. However, I suspect many of our listeners would. We will start the show proper in Ukraine, where a pattern does seem to be emerging. Overnight, another barrage of missiles launched by Russia at Kyiv. Again, basic urban infrastructure seems to have been the target, in this instance a water treatment plant, and probably not coincidentally to the beginning of the new academic year, 2 schools and a university. Reported injuries are at least mercifully few, city authorities acknowledging 3 people injured by shrapnel from Russian missiles destroyed by Ukrainian air defence. And we get accustomed, I guess, to the day in, day out of this, or at least reading about the day in, day out of this. I wanted to ask your fellow Ukrainians, how good have they got at just tuning this stuff out and getting on with life? It does seem a weird thing to be asking people to tune out rocket and artillery barrages at the city they're trying to live in.
I think that's a fair question, Andrew, because strangely enough, yes, the people have learned to adjust to that and just get on with their lives and kind of some of my friends in Kyiv, especially, they say, well, we can hear by the sound of the missile or a drone whether it's close enough to us or not. Do we go just into the corridor with the two walls of the flat, or do we go downstairs into a basement? Is it serious? Is it not? Or do I just keep on sleeping because, there's no escape anyways? But the horrendous nature of this Russian regime doesn't fail to astound me, because similarly to what it is in Russia, in Ukraine, it is the National Knowledge Day. That's when all the kids go back to school. A lot of young children having their first school day ever, going to a special celebration in schools, getting flowers. So imagine that first experience for you as a young kid. Your first day at school, and all you have to do is run to the basement yet again and face this incredible, horrendous war that's being waged on your country.
I just wanted to follow that up and ask whether, I know the priority in Ukraine is actually addressing, dealing with and ideally winning this war, but has there been much conversation yet about what follows? Because it's certainly been my experience of reporting from various conflicts that among the people who seem least bothered while it's actually going on are children, who are incredibly adaptable and at some level often seem to quite enjoy the fact that every day is different and every day is an adventure. But obviously the mental health problems that get stored up and probably come back to haunt generations later on. Is there a conversation going on about this already?
Absolutely, there is. And the mental health crisis is only just brewing up in Ukraine. And there are many experts that are really aware of the fact that as soon as the war is over and we manage to hopefully get some form of victory for Ukrainians out of this war, that there will be another huge challenge, and that will be part of Ukraine's reconstruction, also working with mental health of the nation, because that's when all the issues will start arising. And as you mentioned, this whole new generation that grew up with the war, and it's not just the last 3 years with extremely intensive bombing of all the regions. Ukraine has been at war since 2014. So there have been kids who grew up with the war in the background, reached the age of 18, went to war, and sadly even got killed, all in the duration of their lives.
Simon, we are also, as I said, seeing a pattern, I think, in recent weeks of what Russia is trying to do, and it's attacking the basic infrastructure, but especially attacking the basic infrastructure as winter is looming. That does appear to be, well, for the third winter running, the idea to try and make it as unpleasant for Ukrainians as possible.
Yeah, infrastructure, but also just picking up on what we were talking about just then. I mean, also 18 people, according to reports, were injured on Sunday evening in a strike at a centre for social and psychological rehabilitation for children and an orphanage in the northeast of Ukraine. So it's not just infrastructure, but this is the real tragedy of this conflict, isn't it? Russia's bombardment of apartment blocks, hospitals we saw a few months ago. But certainly I think you do get the feeling that Russia is throwing the kitchen sink at the situation, absolutely everything. So as you say, infrastructure is one of the things they're going to be focusing on. Certainly, obviously, well, when the winter comes, it's going to be particularly brutal. And if you don't have electricity, not just for heating, but for hospitals, for schools, all kinds of things, it's going to be very, very difficult. And the other problem, I suppose, for Ukraine at the moment is that obviously the occupation of the Kursk region, this big gamble that Zelensky took, hasn't really seemed to distract Russian forces as much as was hoped, has it? And Putin says it hasn't stopped the Russian offensive in Donbass. So it does seem to be, as I say, that Russia is taking a real sort of multi-pronged attack approach to attacking Ukraine.
Aliona, I just want to pick up on that point Simon makes there about Russia throwing the kitchen sink at it, and this has traditionally been the way that Russia fights. It knows it has the advantage of enormous mass in all sorts of respects, including personnel, and we have seen repeatedly during this war that they do regard still frontline troops as a broadly expendable resource. But this came up when I was hosting a panel at GlobeSec about the reality of the conflict in Ukraine now. Is there already, and certainly if there isn't already, is there going to be a problem with numbers for Ukraine? They've already, of course, as you know, lowered the conscription age from 27 to 25, but there are reports suggesting that a lot of people being conscripted and or volunteering are well into their 40s and their 50s.
Indeed, and the ones who are still perhaps of my age and perfectly functioning individuals, they're not really well equipped for war. They either not 100% healthy or just not mentally not ready to become a soldier and defend their land. So there are a lot of serious issues with this. I think Ukraine is trying to activate the conscription. Mobilization never really ended from the February of 2022. Men were getting conscripted and sent to the front lines to various trainings. My brother was one of them, and he's the one who's saying, luckily, he's been well and alive for the last 3 years, and hopefully it will stay that way. But that's the reason why he couldn't have one single holiday or a rotation since January this year, because his unit is not fully staffed and there is no way that they could let him go even for a week.
And that right there is an illustration of what we're talking about, because by global standards, that is a shockingly long combat deployment.
And I think it adds to their mental capabilities of being always alert, being ready to fight back, being ready to encounter all of the threats that are coming from all the ways around them. So it's a very difficult situation for the troops. But then, of course, Ukraine is facing a crisis because people are not expendable. And one thing that our military command is good at is not throwing people at a problem and trying to preserve as many troops as they can. Of course, it's not always possible, but while trying to reinforce and get as many people from the peaceful regions to go fight in war. And I know that that's a very active campaign because I get reports of many friends and acquaintances getting mobilized regularly. And also all the men who are here in the West. The Ukrainian men, that's an issue. Another one that's quite sensitive, of course, because you can't just get and deport. The Western governments can't just deport all the Ukrainian men back to Ukraine because they're here for various reasons. Some of them fled legally and are here for a reason with their families or otherwise. But some of them have just escaped the war. And that's, again, we go back to the question of who has enough courage to go and become a soldier. It's an individual choice for everyone.
Simon, just finally on this subject, and it's a more broader global aspect to it. President Vladimir Putin of Russia is visiting Mongolia. Mongolia technically is a signatory of the Rome Statute and therefore a member of the International Criminal Court. Ukraine, possibly somewhat mischievously, is urging Mongolia to arrest him while he is in Ulaanbaatar. It's probably not terribly likely, is it?
I don't think so, no. It's it's an interesting example, isn't it, how legally that move isolated Russia and Putin in so many ways, and morally, legally, it was the right thing to do. But I think with all these situations, when you look at the way the world generally responds to this Russian aggression and treats Russia, there's a difference, as I say, between the legal and the moral thing on the one hand, and the sort of the realpolitik on the other. As we know, there are many, many countries around the world, huge number, especially in the global south, who really think this is a European problem and why should we get involved? And, you, the West, illegally invaded Iraq 20 years ago. So this is, there's no morality, there's no equality here, sort of thing. So, yeah, it would be interesting, should an arrest take place? But, I don't think it's very likely. As I say, it shows the fact that, you can issue these warrants and you can introduce this legislation or make these decisions, but it doesn't mean it's going to have any produce any practical problems for Putin himself.
Well, to Israel now, which is today enduring widespread disruptions of pretty much everything in response to a call by Israel's biggest labour union, Histadrut, for a general strike. The protests follow the weekend's murder by Hamas of 6 more Israeli hostages held captive in Gaza since October 7th. The funeral of one, Hirsch Goldberg Polin, was held in Jerusalem today. In the last few hours, Israel's labour court has ordered an end to the strike on the grounds grounds that this is not, strictly speaking, a labour dispute. And while the unions have accepted the judgment, the protests are continuing. Simon, should we have formed the impression by now that Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's Prime Minister, was never really much interested in getting the hostages home? Part of the reason for the protests is that there are still 97 believed in Gaza, of whom it is thought that 33 are probably dead.
Yes, I mean, obviously his main concern, many people would say anyway, is his own survival, the fact that he needs to keep in power for as long as possible, because if he leaves office, then, of course, he will be prosecuted, and that could be obviously something that he doesn't want to see. So it does look like there is a real feeling that his preferred option, which is to maintain this military conflict, it just isn't working at all. And I think so, we've seen these demonstrations, but it does show how across the country there is even less support now. I'm just interested looking at polls over the weekend that showed a significant public support for a deal rather than this continued military conflict, mistrust of Netanyahu's priorities and motivations, and a really strong desire to see him leave office. So obviously he's going to be forced, I suppose, to continue this strategy, isn't he? Because of his coalition partners. He's got to hold this coalition together. But I think this is just another example. This tragedy of these more dead hostages just shows how that policy, that strategy just isn't working.
Aliona, spokespeople and or apologists for Netanyahu have today been saying, however, that murdering 6 hostages, as Hamas appear to have done, doesn't really look like the actions of people who are much interested in a deal either.
That certainly is true, and we have to remind ourselves that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and inevitably they will act like terrorists. On the other hand, we have statements from President Biden who's saying that the deal is still on the table, despite these escalatory moves of exchange. One side strikes, the other one strikes back. And people are the main victims of that. The deal is still on the table, but he did call on the Prime Minister of Israel to actually make some certain moves to make that deal happen. Of course, with ceasefire, I'm afraid the situation in the Middle East might not fully calm down, because we now have Iran with all its proxies, and geopolitically, Iran is the main actor who's most interested in making this war as long as possible. And they would escalate from Lebanon with their proxy group Hezbollah. The Houthis are escalating yet again in the Red Sea. So I think the bigger international effort should be made in Middle East and should be applied in order to bring situation fully to a halt. And of course, it will all come down to Israel, the return of hostages, but the deal needs to be reached some way.
Simon, President Biden, or at least those responsible for messaging on his behalf, have said that the US is very close, and I quote, to presenting a final, I also quote, take it or leave it proposal. What happens, though, if Israel and or Hamas decide to leave it?
It's very likely that they will do that, won't they? Especially as we've got this new, more militant leadership of Hamas itself. So, in a way, they're both looking to their supporters, aren't they? And looking at their own position in terms of maintaining their leadership of Hamas and as the Israeli government. I think it's also, should they leave it, it's also going to be difficult as well for domestic politics in the US, isn't it? I'm just thinking of Kamala Harris. Last month, she handled this issue very well. I thought most people had thought anyway in her acceptance speech at the convention. But should this situation continue to be an open wound, as it does look like it will do, then it obviously puts her in a difficult position, because that's a very sore issue for the Democrats in the US, with a lot of their supporters who feel that Biden has not been sufficiently tough on Israel. So, there's a sort of international dimension to this as well in terms of politics in the US, and also, as you say, Aliona, with the question of what is happening with Hezbollah and Lebanon as well. So, it's a very, very difficult situation. But the problem is, as I say, I think both sides of this debate, of this conflict, have really there's a real strong motivation for them not to play ball.
Just finally on this one, Aliona, it's been announced in the last hour or two that the UK is going to revoke some export licences for the arms it sells to Israel, 30 licences out of 350 active ones. It's important to note that despite what persistent demonstrations in this country appear to believe, the UK is a tiny supplier of military equipment to Israel. It was all of £18.2 million worth last year, which, grand scheme of things, is absolute beans. So this won't make any practical difference militarily to Israel, but is the symbolic resonance important?
I think it's quite significant that the UK government is now, I think it's the first stance in foreign policy that is different to the previous government, the Conservative one, where they were standing strongly by Israel. But I think that the Conservatives will also following the American position quite closely, and perhaps the current Labour government is getting some signals from overseas as well, at the very least, if not from Biden's administration, then maybe from candidate Harris, because I'm not sure candidate Trump is really going to be very careful with Palestine issue. So it is significant. You're right. I think percentage-wise, the UK was only supplying less than 1% of all the weapons that Israel is receiving from its partners and allies. But the move is quite significant. The only thing I can hope for is that Ukraine will not follow suit and Labour government will stay as committed to supporting Ukraine as they are now, in which Stephen Doughty, the Minister for Europe, did reassure me at GlobeSec yet again that they will do as much, if not more. So.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned GlobeSec, because the team from Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk is just back from this year's iteration of the GlobeSec Forum. It was held this year for the first time in Prague, having relocated from its usual home in Bratislava, wearied of being characterised by Slovakia's combustible Prime Minister Robert Fico as a sinister conclave of cat-stroking liberal globalists. It isn't, to be clear, but in fairness, that's what I would say. There will be highlights in this coming Saturday's edition of The Foreign Desk, including an interview with Ukraine's former Defence Minister Alexei Reznikov. Here, however, is Monocle's Chris Chermak speaking to Slovakia's former Minister for Foreign and European Affairs, Ivan Korčok, at GlobeSec. Chris started by asking him what the conference means to him personally and his thoughts on its perhaps temporary relocation.
The value of this kind of platforms is that it brings people to GlobeSec, and it allows them to speak more freely than usually when we were negotiating in the council or in other forums. And two, and that is what I regret most, it attracts the attention of Europe and of the world at this moment, on the very venue where GlobeSec was taking place. So it was a great advertisement for the country, for my capital of Bratislava. So it meant a lot for me as a foreign minister, but also privately. I am proud, as a both politician and normal Slovak citizen that something like this is taking place in Bratislava. But let's not dwell for too long on this. This is a temporary accident, and I'm absolutely certain that days will come back when once again politicians, high and top-ranking politicians, will again come to GlobeSec in Bratislava.
It is interesting at this moment, I think, that kind of the whole Central European region, and particularly the Visegrad 4, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, they've all been kind of lurching between somewhat more extreme semi-autocratic governments and pragmatic pro-democracy, pro-European governments. They're not the only region dealing with this, but are you able to explain from your perspective why there is such a back and forth?
I think the problem, but we don't see it only in Slovakia, is that politicians are now basically running many countries, including Slovakia, for whom maintaining polarization and division with the country is the main objective, because in that polarized and divided country, they are better off. They can run the country in a much easier way when they mobilize people, when they drive them on barricades, because from that point of view, they are basically overshadowing the most important point. They're not able to resolve real problems of our citizens. And instead, once again, they're feeding them with emotions. They keep them on the barricades. And the result of it so I'm speaking of my own country, is that, we are declining. So it's once again the instrumentalization of emotions. People are scared. There is war. There is war not far away from here, but the war is very close to capital city of my own country, of Bratislava. It's 500 kilometers east of Bratislava, where people are dying. So in this situation, when you are a populist, then it's very easy to feed people, with emotions instead of feeding people with solutions.
But have you been surprised by the fact that fear of war and what you talk about in this region has not necessarily led everywhere to moving closer to Europe, that there have been those groups that have some kind of affection perhaps for Russia, or at least that some governments, including in Slovakia, might be willing to play down what Russia is doing?
Exactly, that's the case in Slovakia. I don't think we have space now to go too far in a history and why there is such a pro-Russian sentiment, but it could be there. But if you are a politician who is aware of, what Russia represents today, that is a threat, this is an aggressor, they are breaching international law, then I think, and that's the difference between populists and between people like myself, you have to lead the people. You have to help them. You have to accompany those people and make them understand what is going on. Because playing with sentiments leads you nowhere. It is taking place in Slovakia that they do play with emotions. And by that, people are losing their compass. They all of a sudden, we see it with Slovak citizens. I have experienced it myself because I was running for the office of president and I was labeled as a warmonger, as somebody who would send young Slovak boys and girls and die on the Eastern Front, so to say. So it's very easy to mobilize with those emotions of fear. Why are they doing that? Because they are irresponsible. And they are once again playing with the most important fact, which I believe is fundamentally important for my country, where Slovakia belongs. We are part of the West. The West as a whole is challenged globally, and we either are firm part of it or we will lose. That's it.
That was Chris Cermak speaking to Slovakia's former foreign minister, Ivan Korčok at Globsec. Aliona, I did want to ask you, obviously, as somebody who was one at Globsec as I was, but two is Ukrainian as I am not, what you made of the conversation around Ukraine, because it struck me that there was a lot more talk about Ukraine, weirdly, this year than there was at Globsec last year. There were certainly a lot more Ukrainians at Globsec this year than there were last year, many of whom we did speak to. Did you perceive that things have shifted one way or the other in the last 12 months?
I think you're right. Things are shifting. I think Central and Eastern Europe are realizing the Ukraine war is an immediate threat to them. Not just their sovereignty, territorial integrity. They've all realized, and that went as a thin thread throughout every single statement or address or panel discussion, that the hybrid threats from Russia reach the Central and Eastern Europe already. They don't need to wait for them to invade the countries. Cyber attacks, disruption, disinformation, meddling in elections. Everyone is experiencing that. And I think they all want to learn from Ukraine on how to combat that, as well as stop Russia in Ukraine rather than wait for it to come to their own soil.
I mean, at the fancy dinner at the castle, we did hear speeches from EC President Ursula von der Leyen, also from Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen, among others. Notably hardline, I thought, from both of them, not just about Russia, but about one or two countries not far from where we were sitting.
That was fascinating to hear from Ursula von der Leyen talking about Hungary, right? I'm sure the country also took part in her re-election, and yet here she was as bold as ever. And as you rightly mentioned, at the fancy dinner, she received the Transatlantic Award from Globsec by keeping the Transatlantic Alliance safe. And she did mention that some of the members of the European Union should not think that the victim is responsible for the war. It is always the aggressor, and she didn't shy away from mentioning Soviet incursion and aggression against Hungary in 1956 and all the rest. So I was quite fascinated by her bravery. Maybe that's also stems from the fact that it's her second term and she's let go now. Yeah.
Great. There's a lovely, slightly sarcastic line that I thought came across very well.
Yep, can't get re-elected, so I can say what I think. Well, let's move along to proverbially workaholic Japan, which is becoming the latest state and or commercial entity to attempt to interest workers in the merits of a 4-day week. Japan's government has been officially promoting the idea since 2021, hoping that extra day might forestall stress-related burnout, thereby alleviating stress on health services, and or encourage Japanese people to create more Japanese people, thereby addressing Japan's gathering demographic crisis. However, Japan's actual workers have proved sluggish on this front, if on no other. By way of one example, 63,000 employees of Panasonic could take a 3-day weekend every week. Only 150 of them do. Simon, why the reluctance, do you think?
I have to say, this is a country where 50 people a year reportedly die because of overwork. And there is a word, I can tell you with my Japanese knowledge, karoshi. It's a terrible thing, but karoshi is where you just literally work yourself to death. But and there's an awful lot of good economic data which shows that actually it is better for productivity when you say to people you can have 80%. Sorry, you can still have 80% of your working week, but double the holiday every week. I mean, wow, what's not to like? So there's an awful lot of good reasons to do this, certainly. As you say, creating the next generation would be one thing. You could go to a park, you could go to the cinema or whatever would be great. I wonder, though, from what we understand of Japanese culture, there's an idea of presenteeism. There's this fear that if you're not, of course, guys, have Friday off, and then we'll watch very carefully just to see which of you really does, and then see what happens to your career. So,
we did talk about this a bit, Aliona, last week in connection with Australia's new rules about the right to disconnect and not answer work emails over the weekend. But is the problem, which may be, as Simon suggests, one of the reasons that the Japanese are so awkward and anxious and reluctant about it, is that if you think, cool, I'll take 3 days off every week, or I won't answer emails after hours, you kind of tilt the field even more towards absolute maniacal psychopaths who will work all the hours that God sends.
I think so. There will inevitably be those maniacal psychopaths, because if we look at workaholism and how it emerged even here in capitalist societies in the West, it's all the people who are trying to make it and become more successful than the other guy or the other girl. And that's where it stems from. So I'm afraid that some people will take a step back and work on their work-life balance. Others will probably succeed more. But I think we can only learn once we actually start experimenting with that, because long-term data will actually show, did this make the society more productive, or did it just divide into more successful people and the quote-unquote lazy ones like we were just hearing? And We'll see where the UK goes on this front too, because Labour government is showing some signs of moving towards 4-day week as well.
When your new enterprise becomes a vast global leviathan, will a 4-day week be on offer for your many employees?
If I become a leviathan, then indeed, yes. I will reinforce the work-life balance as much as I can.
And Simon, I do suspect you probably share my amusement and those of most broadly self-starting media workers at the idea of any such thing as a work-life balance.
Yeah, I could cut it down. Perhaps I could do a 5-day week instead of a 7-day week, but that's the problem. I do remember actually writing a piece some years ago now, looking at corruption in offices and talking to the people who carry out these investigations. And one of the things they look for is workaholics. If you have a colleague who will never take a day off, who works all hours, who will never delegate, who will never even show you what's on their screen and their computer, that can be a sign that they're doing something dodgy. So, that's something else to look out for. But yeah, I think a 4-day week, perhaps I'll try it next week.
So you may just have tipped Monocle's in-house detectives off there as to who has been taking all the biros out of the stationery cupboard. I've been rumbled at last. Simon Brooke and Aliona Hlivco, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, where the failure of democracy across the Middle East is concerned, there is a great deal of blame to go round, and it tends to be predictably apportioned in that the Middle East tends to blame the United States, and the United States tends to blame the Middle East. There are also as many ignored forks in the road as you may care to follow down the hypothetical rabbit holes to which they lead. A new book by Fawaz Gerges, Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics, offers one plausible answer to the question of where it all came unglued. It's called What Really Went Wrong? The West and the Failure of Democracy in the Middle East. I spoke to Fawaz about his new book earlier and began by asking him to explain how early 1950s Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and long-serving Egyptian dictator Gamal Abdel Nasser represent paths not taken.
My argument is that American foreign policy and British foreign policy, remember, wherever the United States goes, Britain follows.
Sure.
This has been so since the end of World War II till today. The reality is that American and British foreign policy collapsed local nationalism with communism. They did not really see any daylight between, the independent nationalist leaders, the post-independence nationalist leaders, like Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, and Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and Soviet communism. So in this particular sense, they confused radical nationalism with Soviet communism. And I think even though I focus just on Mossadegh and Nasser, I think this applies to many of the decolonized world after the end of the colonial era in 1945. That American foreign policy really was not interested in coming to terms with the post-independent nationalist leaders who wanted to really get rid of the colonial legacy, who wanted to basically build organic states, who wanted to create economies independent of the West, who wanted to chart a new foreign policy independent of the two rival camps, the American land camp and the Soviet camp. And in this particular sense, I think Mossadegh in Iran and Egypt, not only I choose the two leaders, remember, Iran as a non-Arab state was and is a pivotal state, and Egypt is the most populous Arab state. So it's not just about the two leaders, it's about two of the most pivotal states, and how American foreign policies ruptured politics and development in both Iran and Egypt and altered the trajectory of politics and state and society, not just in Iran and Egypt, but in most of the Middle East after the end of World War II.
There was certainly after the events of 9/11 and what followed a lot of reflection on the previous decades of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Is it entirely fair to ascribe everything that has gone wrong since to American meddling? Does it not? And I grant, obviously, that in the case of Mohammad Mossadegh in particular, overthrown in a clearly CIA-backed coup d'etat, that was an especially egregious example of American meddling, and I don't think many serious Americans still defend it. But does that analysis not deny Arab and the Persian country agency of their own? Do they not get to choose how they respond to American meddling or Western meddling, however obnoxious they find it?
Look, I'm glad you're asking this question. My book is not about really blame either the West or the autocrats in the region. What I have tried to do is to reconstruct this particular important historical moment. And I think it was a pivotal moment. It was a very promising moment, the moment immediately after the end of World War II, in order to really show how the dreams and the hopes of post-independent leaders were sacrificed at the altar of the global Cold War. In a way, in fact, it's not just American foreign policy alone to be blamed. It's also the partnership between American foreign policy and local autocrats. In fact, you cannot really understand what has happened in the Middle East in the past 75 years without understanding this organic partnership between American foreign policy and local autocrat. In fact,
and I guess that the two obvious pertinent examples there are the Shah in Iran and Mubarak in Egypt.
Absolutely. And I think what I'm really trying to show is that by understanding this particular moment, we really can make sense of what has happened in the Middle East in the past 75 years. In fact, my book really provides a historical and conceptual framework in order to understand why the Middle East is where it is today.
I mean, do you think then that there are lessons from this period that can be usefully applied to the Middle East as it now is? If the United States and the wider West wanted to dramatically rethink its policy to that region based on the lessons taught by your book, what should they start doing differently?
Well, look, first of all, I don't believe that the United States or Britain will change their approach to the Middle East. This is really, I think we would like somehow to see a kind of progressive foreign policy. And many American realists, as you know, they ask the question, is a progressive foreign policy ever possible? Because they look at international relations through the lens of realism. I mean, if you ask me what I want the Middle East to be left to its own devices. I want Middle Eastern people to determine their own affairs, to really take charge of their history. And in fact, really in the past 500 years, and your listeners might be surprised, the Middle East has never been left alone for the past 600 years. First, the Ottoman Empire, then classical European colonialism, and then really American informal empire. And in this particular sense, I think what we need to understand when people say why the Middle East is so unstable, why the Middle East is so violent, it's not because there is some really rotten gene out there, because I think we need to understand not only the as you said, the importance of local agency, but also repeated and continuous foreign interventions in the internal affairs of the region.
That was Fawaz Gerges. His new book is What Really Went Wrong, The West and the Failure of Democracy in the Middle East. It's available now and obviously very much recommended. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Aliona, Hlivco and Simon Brooke. Also to Chris Chermak. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.